I'm Kris Sims.
And I'm Todd, MacKay.
This is the Canadian Taxpayers podcast. We're dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. In this episode, we're going to do a deep dive into the Trudeau government's plan to ban and then buy back thousands of guns.
We've got a Waste Watch story about a mayor who got convicted of fraud, but still walked away with a pile of taxpayers' money.
That's quite the story. Today, we also have an extended episode because we're joined by a special guest, former Member of Parliament Michelle Simson. She talks about what it's like to try to get MPs to take a pay cut and provide more transparency.
Yeah, please stay around. Listen to Michelle. She's going to say some stuff that you almost never hear politicians talk about. It's a really interesting inside look at the whole political machine. But first, we need to tell you about a few breaking stories. We have a huge win to tell you about, and it started right here on the Taxpayer Podcast. We broke the story that the federal government was still charging an 18% tariff on medical masks and other protective equipment that we all need in order to fight the COVID-19 outbreak.
Our investigative reporter, James Wood, broke the story on our website, taxpayer.com. Then we talked about it here on the podcast, and then it was picked up by the website National News Watch. Lo and behold, just a few days after our exclusive story was posted on our website, and we talked about it here on the podcast, this tweet came across the Twitter machine from my old friend at Global News, David Aiken in Ottawa. Quote, after a taxpayer.com story last week on this, then he shared the official announcement from Finance Canada that says, quote, to keep Canadians safe during the COVID-19 pandemic, we are waiving tariffs on certain medical goods, including PPE, such as masks and gloves. There's the win.
You know, before our investigative reporter, James Wood, got into this, nobody else was covering this. Nobody at all. But now, because he brought attention to the issue, he was burning up the phone lines to Finance Canada as well as Health Canada. Canadians will now be able to import things that they need to protect themselves from the COVID-19 situation without paying an 18% tariff. So great work by James Wood. He worked hard on the story and it's making a difference. So way to go for him. And check out the show notes. He's actually doing follow-up stories and you might want to read more about it. So check those out.
We've got another bit of breaking news. We also have an update on our big push to get members of parliament to take a pay cut.
So the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we did a national survey this past week, and it shows that fully 2/3 of Canadians want members of parliament to reduce their own pay. So we did this survey through the Angus Reid Forum. Of course, that isn't cheap. Hundreds of Canadian Taxpayers Federation supporters chipped in to make that happen. And it proves a point that we've been making all along. Politicians need to show leadership by cutting their own salaries. Right now, members of parliament make about $182,000 a year. Canadians across the country have seen their savings shrink and their incomes go down. Many have lost their jobs. MPs need to take a pay cut right now and show some leadership.
Absolutely. And if you take a look at the numbers, if all members of parliament took a 20% pay cut for 1 year, that would actually save Canadian taxpayers $12.3 million. So what could that money do otherwise? Well, $12.3 million would actually buy groceries for more than 1,000 Canadian families for a whole year.
And listen, this is about a bigger issue. Ultimately, governments are going to have to work very, very hard to control spending after the smoke clears from the COVID-19 situation. Politicians need to take the first step by cutting their own pay so that they're showing leadership when they ask others to tighten their belts as well. This is a bigger issue than just MP pay. This is about controlling government spending overall. But we need MPs to take leadership. That's why if you check out taxpayer.com or check out the show notes, please hit our petition and put your name down to push politicians to take pay cuts.
Absolutely. Let's make that one happen. Coming up next, we're going to do a deep dive into the Trudeau government's plan to ban and then buy back guns next with our federal director, Aaron Wudrick. Stay with us.
It's time for Deep Dive. This is the part of the show where we get into important issues at a deeper level. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation Federal Director Aaron Wudrick is here to talk with me about Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's recently announced gun ban and buyback. And Aaron, I have to tell you, I find this to be it's a tough topic to talk about. And one of the reasons it's tough is because it is connected to tragedy. It's heartbreaking to think about the 22 people who were murdered in Nova Scotia. And, I think back even for myself, in 2006, I was at the funeral for one of the RCMP officers who was shot and killed in the line of duty near Spiritwood, Saskatchewan. This is a tough issue because it affects people in really the deepest possible way.
It really is a tough issue. And, full disclosure, I'm a city boy, so I don't hunt or own guns. But I do know that in Canada, guns are a part of life for a lot of people, a lot of hunters, a lot of farmers. And when I put myself in their shoes, it's easy to see why law-abiding gun owners feel like they're being attacked because of crimes other people have committed.
Yeah, actually, I'm the opposite. I grew up in rural Saskatchewan. I live in Moose Jaw, and I do enjoy hunting. So, we're kind of the mirror opposites in this conversation. But this is why I think it's important to talk it through, and hopefully we can bring up some points that we're not seeing other places.
Good idea, and we should start with this clip from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's announcement.
Today, we are closing the market for military-grade assault weapons in Canada. We are banning 1,500 models and variants of these firearms by way of regulations. These weapons were designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. There is no use and no place for such weapons in Canada. For many families, including many Indigenous people, firearms are part of traditions passed down through generations, and the vast majority of gun owners use them safely, responsibly, and in accordance with the law, whether it be for work, sport shooting, for collecting, or for hunting. But you don't need an AR-15 to bring down a deer. So, effective immediately, it is no longer permitted to buy, sell, transport, import, or use military-grade assault weapons in this country.
So here's what's happening. On May 1st, the Trudeau government issued what's called an order in council, which is just a decision made by cabinet. They didn't put a bill through parliament to be voted on. They just made a order. They're allowed to do that through cabinet, but there is not the level of transparency you get with a bill. This order in council made it illegal to buy, sell, or use any of the what they're calling military-style assault rifles on their list. And in 2 years, the Prime Minister says he'll pass legislation to buy those guns back with taxpayer money. And this applies to licensed gun owners.
Yeah, and that's an important point there about the licensed gun owners. So there's a lot that goes into getting your gun license. You have to pass a course, take a test. You need to get a criminal record check. You also need to get your spouse to sign off. And if you have any mental health issues, they can check into that as well. Obviously, that's a lot of paperwork that most criminals don't generally do.
No, and in fact, the murderer responsible for the tragedy in Nova Scotia didn't have a gun license and got at least some of the guns that he used illegally from the United States. Here's a clip from Michelle Rempel, who's a Conservative MP from Alberta, who posted this on her website.
There is no data that shows that what he did today is going to have any impact whatsoever on firearms violence in Canada, because we know that the vast overwhelming amount of guns that are used in firearms related crime in Canada are illegally smuggled from the United States. Nothing that he announced today is going to do that. All he did was criminalize anybody who owns one of these 1,500 different models.
Now, the lack of data in this debate is pretty frustrating. So here are a few facts. Statistics Canada reports that there were 249 gun murders in Canada in 2018. And of those, 143 involve handguns. So 143 out of 249 murders in Canada involved handguns. And yet the Prime Minister's ban and proposed buyback doesn't include handguns. And another key point, CBC reporter John Paul Tasker looked into the numbers, and he found that between 70 and 99% of guns used in crimes actually come from the United States. So in other words, taking guns from licensed gun owners is not going to do anything to stop criminals from smuggling guns across the border illegally. So most gun murders are committed with handguns and illegal guns. So Ottawa's gun ban and buyback actually has no chance of stopping the majority of gun murders.
And those are important points to consider, but there are also questions about the definition of the term assault rifle. So Ottawa's Order in Council doesn't define the term. It just plows ahead and lists a lot of guns that are now banned. And honestly, it looks pretty arbitrary. I'll use two guns to illustrate the issue. The government is now banning a gun called the Ruger Mini 14. It's a semi-automatic rifle, which means that you have to pull the trigger for each shot. You can't just pull the trigger down and blast away. That was the gun tragically used at the Polytechnique murders in 1989. The other gun I'll mention is called an SKS. So the Soviet Union developed the SKS for its military. Really, you could call it an assault rifle. However, it's a semi-automatic as well. So again, you have to pull the trigger for each shot. And that made it obsolete just a few years later when the AK-47 came out, because the AK-47 is fully automatic. You can just pull the trigger and blast away. Now, the AK-47 and all fully automatic rifles haven't been allowed in Canada for a long time, but you can buy surplus SKS rifles in Canada for $300-400. They're actually very common. In fact, the two young murderers who killed 3 people in northern BC in 2019, they used SKSs. But it's weird because the Prime Minister's ban and buyback plan doesn't include the SKS. And here's another odd point of comparison between those two specific rifles. The Mini 14 uses bullets that are about 75 grains at most. That's a little less than 5 grams. The SKS uses bullets that are about twice as big. So if you're trying to ban guns that are dangerous, there's not a lot of logic in banning the Mini 14, but not banning the SKS.
Okay, but just to play devil's advocate with you, what if Ottawa was to just ban the SKS as well? What if it was just going to draw the line instead at all semi-automatics? Would that make more sense?
Well, that would cause some more really big problems. So first, the SKS is a pretty common gun. It's impossible to know exactly how many are out there, but it's a good bet that there's a lot of them, and that means it would cost millions and millions of dollars to buy them all back. Now, if Ottawa went even further and banned all semi-automatics, the buyback bill would be exponentially bigger. And then you're dealing with another logical problem. You fix one problem and you cause another one. The Prime Minister has a point when he says you don't need an AR-15 to bring down a deer, but he doesn't have a point for the reason he thinks he does. So like I said, the Ruger Mini 14 and many other so-called assault rifles fire a relatively small .223 caliber bullet. Every single deer hunter I know uses rounds that are significantly more powerful than a .223. My buddy, his 12-year-old daughter uses a bigger gun than a .223. So if the goal is to ban dangerous guns, that's a real problem because all guns are dangerous if they're not used properly. In fact, the gun used at the Spiritwood tragedy, it was a .30-30. In fact, that's the same gun that the murderer used to kill Corporal Nathan Cirillo and storm Parliament in 2014.
Now, as you know, I've already said I'm not a gun guy, so I need you to help me out a bit. I don't know what a .30-30 looks like. Is there maybe some reference points that you could give me so I know what kind of gun you're talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So if you've watched old Western movies, you've probably seen John Wayne carrying an old .30-30. That's what it is. You don't imagine Rambo, imagine a cowboy. That's what a .30-30 looks like. It doesn't look like the guns that are getting banned, but if you don't use it safely, it can be dangerous as well.
Now, I'm trying to think of an analogy that works for me as someone who doesn't shoot guns. So how about this? Is this policy that Trudeau's introduced a bit like trying to stop drunk drivers by banning vodka, but not banning whiskey?
Yeah, actually, that's a pretty good way of looking at it. In fact, I'd even go a step further. This is probably more like banning highball glasses, but not shot glasses or beer mugs.
Well, and that actually takes us to another important point. As we know, at this point, Ottawa has just banned these guns with their order in council. But the Prime Minister says that he's going to bring legislation forward to compensate law-abiding gun owners who have to give up their guns. The Liberal election platform included a $200 million commitment to buy those guns. But the reality is it could actually be a lot more. We all remember the infamous long gun registry from the 90s that was only supposed to cost $2 million, but the actual cost ended up being more than $1 billion. So, these things spiral out of control quickly. And again, remember, this money is not going to be buying the guns that are actually used by criminals.
Well, yeah, and back in 2018, the federal government announced it would spend $86 million over 5 years to stop illegal guns from coming into Canada. Now, that makes a lot of sense to a lot of us, gun owners or not. If illegal guns are coming in from the States, let's stop those illegal guns from coming in. If the Prime Minister took that $200 million that he's earmarked to buy back guns from law-abiding gun owners and put it to border security, he could more than double that funding.
Yeah, it'd be a significant amount. And if you consider that the average RCMP officer's salary is about $86,000 a year, for $200 million, that gets you could hire 460 Mounties dedicated to stopping gun crime for 5 years with that $200 million.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ontario Premier Doug Ford clearly looked at exactly those kind of choices. And here's what he told the Canadian press, quote, "I can't help but think this money could be put to a much better use, hunting down violent criminals and stopping illegal guns at our borders."
And here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we push hard for government accountability. And accountability, of course, is all about choices. So perhaps the Prime Minister has convincing evidence that spending hundreds of millions to take guns from law-abiding citizens will help more than stopping gun smuggling and hiring police officers. But we haven't seen those questions asked, let alone answered. And there hasn't really been any significant debate about this because he did this with an order in council rather than taking it to Parliament, which would have allowed for a lot more scrutiny and a lot more debate and a lot more accountability.
And that's a really huge issue. Aside from the merit of the actual policy, obviously there are people who are passionately on either side of this. There's a right way and a wrong way to do things, and this is the wrong way to do it. Accountability is really important. It's wrong for the Prime Minister and his cabinet to just force this through without any debates or votes in Parliament.
And we've looked at this issue and, of course, surveyed our supporters as we always do, and we've concluded that this policy introduced by the Trudeau government is bad policy and that the Prime Minister is imposing it in the wrong way. So we've launched a petition opposing the Prime Minister's gun ban and buyback.
And if you'd like to sign that petition, just click the link in the show notes or head over to taxpayer.com.
Hi, I'm Scott Hennig, President of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Sorry for interrupting the podcast, but I wanted to take a few seconds of your time to tell you more about the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. We are 235,000 Canadians from coast to coast that are fed up. We are fed up with politicians taking too much out of our paychecks, often to waste it on a bunch of pet projects, corporate welfare, and pork barreling to buy votes. We organize campaigns to push back on these politicians. These campaigns often include petition drives, billboards, media stunts, and more. But most importantly, they ask our supporters to pitch in and take action. Alone, we're a voice in the wilderness. Together, we're an army to be reckoned with. You can join the fight and sign up at no cost at taxpayer.com. That website again is taxpayer.com. Okay, now back to the podcast.
It's time for Waste Watch. This is when we make fun of the dumb things governments are spending your money on. Today, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Renaud Brossard. Renaud is the Quebec Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Renaud, what do you have for us today?
Thanks, Kris. Now, imagine that you're retiring and it's your last day of work. What do you imagine that would look like?
Probably lots of cards, maybe some balloons, maybe a cake.
Okay, let's add a little plot twist to this. Imagine that instead of retiring because you wanted to retire, you're retiring because you lost your job because you got convicted of fraud.
Fraud. Okay, sounds like there might be handcuffs instead of cake.
Well, that's exactly what happened to the former mayor of Montreal, Michael Applebaum.
Oh, no.
So Mr. Applebaum served nearly 2 decades, first as Montreal City Councillor and then as mayor. And, well, on one fateful day on June 2013, he was arrested on 14 charges, including corruption and bribery. And he was convicted on 8 of those charges.
Whoa. Okay. I think that corruption convictions count as just cause for getting fired. Don't let the door hit you in the backside on the way out.
Well, Applebaum got a lot more than advice about closing doors when he left. Even though he was convicted of fraud, the self-serving civil servant still gets to keep his $260,000 taxpayer-funded severance package.
Whoa.
And, well, to their credit, the city of Montreal tried to get it back from him after he was convicted. Because, let's face it, being convicted for fraud is something pretty bad. And I think most people would say that you don't deserve more taxpayer dollars afterwards.
No kidding. Of course not. These kisses goodbye for these politicians are already pretty generous, even for the folks who don't break the law while they're in office. Why would anybody be allowed to keep this?
Well, if you think this is bad, it actually gets worse. Because not only is Applebaum getting to keep his plush $260,000 taxpayer-funded severance package, he's also getting the green light to get his pension for all his years spent in service of the public.
Oh.
And we made a calculation. If he lives to age 90, he'll have collected over $1 million from this pension. Now, once again, to their credit, the City of Montreal is in court trying to appeal the ruling regarding its severance package to at least get that money back in taxpayers' pockets. And we really hope they're successful. But that kind of payout happening to a convicted public official is pure nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
It just shouldn't happen.
No.
And that's why this year we gave Applebaum the Lifetime Achievement Award at this year's Teddy Waste Award ceremony. To be a city councillor and then mayor and then get convicted of fraud and still keeping your golden parachute, well, I have to say that is an individual deserving of a golden pig statue with his name on it if I've ever seen one.
Oh, no kidding. This is why we do at the Taxpayers Federation. It's why we do the Teddy Waste Award ceremony every year. It's to highlight these outrageous wastes of money.
You're 100% right. If we don't shine a huge spotlight on this kind of government waste, it'll just keep happening unchecked. You can watch a Teddy Waste Award ceremony on our Taxpayer YouTube channel. You'll see a link in the show notes.
Oh, it's quite the show. For anybody who hasn't watched our Teddy Waste Award ceremony, I do recommend it, because if we shine a spotlight on this waste and we embarrass these politicians and bureaucrats, they might think twice about doing this next time and wasting this money. And getting right down to brass tacks, we also have a petition on our website that you can sign in order to help put a stop to this kind of nonsense. The petition calls for governments to make sure that if a politician goes corrupt, like getting convicted of fraud, for example, that they're no longer eligible for taxpayer-funded pensions anymore. It's crazy that we need to say that out loud, but here we are. So do head over to our website, taxpayer.com, and sign that petition.
Today, I'm chatting with Michelle Simson. Michelle served as a Liberal Member of Parliament for Scarborough Southwest from 2008 to 2011. She's a regular guest on the Roy Green radio show. But she made history when she became the first and only Member of Parliament to post her expense receipts right online. You didn't have to ask for it. You didn't have to submit a form. You could just check it right on the website. But today, I actually wanted to ask her about something different. I wanted to ask her about Member of Parliament salaries. And before we get into your experience as an MP, a lot of Canadian Taxpayers Federation supporters think that MPs right now should be taking a pay cut. Michelle, thank you so much for being here with us, and I'm really interested in your perspective. What do you think MPs should be doing with their salaries right now?
Well, first off, it's my pleasure to be speaking with you. But with respect to their salaries, the automatic $3,700 for sure, it never should have gone through. I mean, it's not unprecedented that MP salaries get frozen, but not only that, but at this juncture, take a cut, of say 10 or 15% without even taking the raise. And I think it would be the thing to do because when the MPs' wages were frozen, back when I was an MP by Jim Flaherty, the then finance minister, it was wildly popular with the public that, they were at least freezing salaries.
You're not a member of parliament anymore. So some might say, it's easy for you to say, you're not the one in there anymore. How did you feel about this sort of thing when you were a member of parliament?
Well, I wasn't popular, Todd, but I can tell you that when in 2008, things started to really go into the dumper, and I suggested to my caucus that we take a 15% cut in pay as a show of solidarity with the Canadian people. They were losing their jobs. They were losing pensions. It was really terrible. And it wasn't met with any degree of support, I can tell you that.
When you stood up, when you were walking up to the microphone in your caucus meeting to ask for that pay cut and to recommend that to your colleagues, how confident did you feel? What was going on in your head at that point?
I'll be honest, I was a bit nervous because I was really a rookie. And I'd already spoken privately to a few people who didn't really like the idea at all. They didn't want to take a cut, nothing. So I thought, well, I can't not say something and maybe see if there was a general feel that maybe it's something they would consider. So I got up, I said my piece, but put it this way, it was like being heckled when you're in Parliament. It just did not go over. And I talked to other people, other MPs in other parties, and they didn't even want to entertain the notion of taking a cut in their pay.
I want to take you back to that room. You were nervous when you're going up to the microphone. Then you say what you're going to say, and you're going to sit down. How did you feel? How did it look when you looked around the room?
Oh, it looked, I guess, like I expected it to be, to a certain degree. It was not pleasant at all. And it was the same look I got when I stood up and spoke to caucus about posting my expenses, because I was under fire for that. Every time I relate these stories, I don't want people to get the feeling I'm not a team player, except that the team I was playing on for were the taxpayers and constituents.
And I should point out, you served as a Liberal MP, but members of Parliament, as much as they yell at each other in question period, they socialize quite a bit across party lines. Tell me a little bit more about what those conversations were like with people in the other parties as well. What kind of feedback did you get from them?
To be honest, it was not much different than it was within my own caucus. People were so reluctant. Maybe one or two said it was really the thing to do, but certainly there wasn't any kind of support, like real support in terms of numbers for that. They, you get comments like, "Have you lost your mind? We work hard for our money," is what they always used to say. And I said, everybody works hard. Ours is just a different way of working, but I don't feel I work harder than my constituents, and that's what I would say.
That's such an interesting point. I often hear that as well. And I think, to be fair to members of Parliament, it's not an easy job. It's not easy to be traveling back and forth to Ottawa and away from your family. It's not easy to have every little thing you said or done absolutely hashed through on Twitter. It's not easy, but it's also not easy to plant and harvest a crop. It's not easy to take care of cancer patients in a hospital. Every job is hard. And everybody, especially right now, is taking a pay cut. And how do you lead people if you're not willing to go through what they're going through?
Well, my opinion is, when something like this happens, and it was like that in 2008, only it wasn't medical, if you don't take some action, like cutting pay, or at least like not having it go through a pay increase, and that would be the very least, I don't believe you have the moral authority to govern and understand what people are going through.
When you were first elected, you brought this bold innovation that nobody else was doing in as a member of parliament before. You started actually posting line by line accounting of your expenses. Nobody else was doing that. You're the first one. What in the world were you thinking? Why'd you do that?
Well, it did start when I was running, and I was going to, you knock door to door to door, and I kept hearing about how politicians were crooks. They were, they wouldn't account for anything. And I promised my constituents that I couldn't change the entire party. I was only one person, but that I would do whatever it took to show them that I would account not only for their money, but for my actions, that I was always available for that. And they really seem to appreciate that. I don't know how many believed, because everyone's so skeptical and so cynical about politicians. But I made that promise, and I did it. At the end of I was only a part fiscal year from October until March 31st. But I thought, there's a good chance to get started. And it did go over very well. I got a lot of, everything I got was positive feedback.
Okay, so let's break that apart a little bit, because you got different feedback from different groups in terms of your colleagues versus your constituents. Let's start with your constituents. What kind of things did you hear back from them?
I got emails, phone calls. They'd leave them on the answering machine at the office. They'd come by and congratulate me on having done that. And they wondered, everyone wanted to know when everyone else was going to follow suit. So from that aspect, it was extremely positive. From my colleagues, it was as negative as it was positive with the constituents.
I want to go to them in just a second and talk about that side of the equation. But just to finish with your constituents, I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about posting expenses, especially in the political realm, they're worried about backlash, that people will see, oh, I see you spent $16 on an orange juice or whatever. Did you get any blowback like that? Did you get criticism on your actual expenses? Did you find yourself on the defense of having to explain some of them?
Well, no, there was one when I was interviewed on a television station, and I got a bit of blowback from the host, who said, I see on your, from your website, you spent $217 on a family skate. The problem was, he assumed that it was my family, but it was a skate that I sponsored for Family Day in February.
So it wasn't your family, it was everybody's family skate.
It was, yeah, I did it for my constituents.
Right. And that allows a discussion. Like, some people may think that that was a poor use of money, or the family skate was a poor use of money, or whatever, but at least you can have the discussion, which allows your constituents to hold you accountable, but also allows you to defend yourself if you really believe in what you did.
Exactly. And if you can't defend an expense, you shouldn't have made it. That's my opinion. If you can't defend, people will disagree with maybe how the money got spent, but it wasn't a lot of money, but how why'd you spend it on this or that? And they can disagree, and that's their right. But I think, all in all, I didn't get a lot of that kind of feedback oh, why'd you spend this? Why'd you spend that? The other thing I never did was you have a certain degree, back then it was about 8,000, it's probably a lot more, that you could spend on hospitality. I never spent that money. If I was taking a constituent or someone out for lunch or dinner, I paid my own, I paid for it myself, because I thought, gee, I did in the private sector make very, very good money, but I still thought I made enough that if I can't do this, don't do it. I'm not going to do it with the taxpayers' money.
So let's move to the other side of it now. Usually politics, like any other competitive sector, is a very much a copycat game. If somebody figures out how to do something that's popular with their constituents and has minimal negative blowback, usually everybody else is copying that new innovation. How did your colleagues feel about what you did?
There were three in my caucus that decided to do what I did, but it didn't last too long, because the leader at the time, he said, I don't want anyone freelancing, and I want you to take down anything you put up. They decided that that was the best course for them. I said, I'm not taking it down, and I'm going to keep doing it.
Usually when a leader sort of imposes something like that, leaders, and it was Ignatieff at the time, Michael Ignatieff was the leader, if I recall correctly. Yeah. There's at least some semblance of a reason given. You have to take it down because. What was the because in this case? Because he said so. He said he was worried that there would be a discrepancy among the caucus on how they reported it. And you know what? That was BS, because I said, I have a template, and it was actually my husband that developed the template, and he used to work with my staff to make sure that it all balanced and it was all right, like in terms of making sure it was accurate in every respect. But Mr. Ignatieff, he said the other thing was he was concerned if people got audited, that they would have hidden it anyway. That was another thing that came up. They would have, put it, if they were left to do it themselves, they would lump things together that maybe weren't accurate. But again, that was no excuse. There was a way he could have looked after the whole thing by saying, this is what we're going to do. Even if he didn't like my template, this is what we're going to use, and it's going to be consistent across the board. But no, I think there was a concern that there were too many cans that had worms to open up those cans. That's a bizarre line of thinking, that it wouldn't be standardized enough. Like, they're generally accepted accounting standards that can be applied. It's not rocket science to put that together. And to fail to do an audit because you might find a problem, that's like saying you won't put a smoke detector in because it might detect smoke. But that's the whole point.
Exactly. The whole thing about expenses, I got a lot of attention when it blew up that Parliament would not allow, the Board of Internal Economy would not allow the Auditor General to look at individual MPs' books, as it were. Just said no, and all heck broke loose when that happened, and rightfully so. I was so angry about that they just shut the door on the Auditor General. I saw it as an opportunity to kind of clean slate for a lot of people, but I guess I'm a little bit odd.
Sometimes it's good to be odd. I do see a real irony, though, because I think that there was a fear there that information would get out that would make MPs look bad, or I don't think they could look worse than people are imagining them to be because they won't let people in. What could possibly be so bad that they can't allow the Auditor General to take a look?
Well, in a lot of cases, you're absolutely correct. But then there were other cases. Two of my colleagues, and it was reported widespread in the media, were cheating in rent expenses, both of them, to the tune of well in excess of $150,000 each.
When those things come out, everybody assumes that all MPs are doing that unless there's enough transparency to show that that's not the case.
Absolutely, Todd. That was always my argument. You know, you may have a few bad apples in all the parties, but clean it out, get it done, and let's move on. And the taxpayers, the Canadian public, will appreciate it. I know they will, in terms of not election, re-election bids, but certainly it would go a long way to reestablishing a little bit of trust with the government.
There are consequences for standing up to a leader in politics. What kind of consequences did you face?
Well, they did try at one point to try to bribe me by giving me a bigger office with a private bathroom, but that wouldn't work. But in terms of punishment, I was gagged. I was no longer allowed to speak in the House of Commons, and not just questions, but certainly, MPs stand up when something either good or maybe tragic happens in their riding, and they want to speak to it in public. I couldn't do that. I had a police officer that was killed in the line of duty. Nope, you're not allowed to speak to it. And another young lad who went to Afghanistan and after 3 weeks had been killed, and couldn't speak to that either.
It doesn't seem right. You were the elected official for your riding. You can agree with the voters in that riding in their choice of sending you or not, but they sent you, and you then didn't have a voice because of that.
I viewed it as rather unconstitutional on behalf of my constituents, because that's what they elected me to do, to be their voice in the House of Commons and within government. But you see, it's gotten so MPs are being used to take back the message, the party line, to their constituents, things that have already transpired, or, it shouldn't be that way. I was there, I saw my job to voice what they really wanted. And on a few votes, there was 15 of us, I remember, that went against the leader because it was a whip vote, and we stood up. We didn't just sit it out or, pretend we had the flu. We stood up, 15 in the Liberal Party, to support a private member's bill about the First Nations having to open their books.
Yeah, and that's a piece of legislation that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation worked hard to pass, the First Nations Financial Transparency Act. And we worked very hard with a courageous woman from the Onion Lake Cree Nation, Charmaine Stick, to go to court to defend that law.
At the time that we originally voted on this, where there was 15, otherwise it was a minority government, and that bill would have gone down at that point. And I said to a few people, they said, "You're not going to vote with the Conservatives, are you?" I said, "Of course. I said, I'm about transparency, particularly as it relates to financial, and because it's the taxpayers' money. So if I put myself out there to do it, I want to see everyone that has their hand in the taxpayer's pocket do the same.
I want to go back to the consequences a little bit, and the offering you a bigger office with a private bathroom to look the other way on a significant matter of principle for you. Can you take us into that conversation? Like, where was it? How did that conversation go down?
The one thing I can say is I go out of my way to avoid confrontation just for the sake of confrontation. But this became such a matter of principle when I had the discussion with the whip, who was actually the one who was meting out all the consequences. When I got the offer of a bigger office with a private washroom, I just laughed and I said, you know, you must be an idiot to think that I would fall for, or I could be bought off with an office. I said, you don't know anything about me. And, you know, there was pushback, and he started to get angry. I said, look, why don't you do everybody a favor? And I know you won't, because you'd have a lot of explaining to do. Just expel me from caucus. In some respects, Todd, I thought, I'd rather have that happen and not lose my voice. But I thought, you know what? You're a bunch of cowards. You won't expel me because, oh my God, if the press ever got a hold of that and the reason I was being expelled, I think they would have had a lot of explaining to do to the public.
Yeah, and I think it's telling that they didn't want to have that explanation out there. If they felt confident in their decision, they would have been happy to do it, but clearly that wasn't the case.
No, because it was almost like I said, I dare you. That's all you can do to me. That's all that's left. You can't fire me because I was elected. So you know what? If you feel that strongly that I did the wrong thing, kick me out of caucus. Oh, I knew that wasn't going to go.
That would have been awkward. You know, I've talked to some politicians about this sort of thing before, and if you get the opportunity to catch them in an unguarded moment, sometimes they'll admit to you that reforming pension plans, taking pay cuts, expenses, they just don't think it matters. They don't think people care. When they're outdoor knocking, what people want to talk about are taxes and healthcare and filling potholes, but they don't want to talk about politicians' expenses and all that kind of thing. It just doesn't matter. It ends up costing the politician money without any political benefit. Are they right? No.
I think that's another way of saying I don't want to have to explain it. Because what would prevent them from doing exactly what I did? Line by line by line. What difference, if they're saying it doesn't make any difference to the public, why don't you just do it? And then you can say, it's out there. I've been honest. I've been transparent. But if these people are saying it doesn't matter, I've got reams of that I kept them in hard copy of emails. And it wasn't just in my riding, it was across Canada, Alberta, BC, because they got wind of it on the news.
That's interesting that you heard from Canadians both in your riding and across the country. Right now, we're pushing hard on members of parliament to take a pay cut. We've seen politicians in New Zealand, in India, Japan, Malta taking pay cuts. Certainly, Canadian politicians can do it as well. What can ordinary Canadians do to get this message through to their politicians?
Well, I would confess right now with the pandemic, people have their minds on other things, but under ordinary circumstances, they have to do what they did with Mike Duffy. They have to keep up the pressure, keep it up, and make it a talking point. Because for a politician or an MP to say when he goes door to door, they're concerned about taxes. Well, we're part of the problem when you're an MP. You really are, because you've got a base salary. I mean, it's bizarre. And you get, for every other thing you do, in terms of being a vice chair in a committee, it was about $6,000. I don't know what it is now, but $6,000 a year more on top of your normal salary. And if you're the chair of a committee, it was $12,000. So it is, you get paid for extras that, in my view, weren't really extra. That's what you're paid to do when you're an MP. You sit on committees, you do extra work, and it's not like these people get conscripted. You volunteer by running. And then to say, oh, well, we work so hard. Well, sorry, everybody does.
Mm-hmm. Your time as an MP was a pretty rough ride. Ultimately, you got squeezed out between the Orange Crush and the Conservatives picking up seats, and the Liberal caucus shrunk ultimately. So it was a rough ride. It wasn't one of those sort of long and storied careers in the House of Commons. Do you have any regrets?
None at all. I wasn't even distressed when I wasn't reelected, to tell you the truth. No tears, I had my life back. And the reason I didn't have a life was because of the decisions I made, which I would never change. Because above all else, I value my integrity and my good name.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us, and for also taking a stand. It's always interesting to see a politician receive recognition because of success they've had and policies they've successfully put through. I think too often we fail to recognize politicians who make sacrifices based on principle, and I want to thank you for that as well.
Well, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation did appreciate what I did, more so than my own party. I was there for a short time, but I had a good time.
Thank you so much for chatting with me and for taking the time to tell your story to our listeners.
And I thank you, Todd. It was a pleasure.
Wow, that was quite the interview. We need more MPs like her, more politicians that are willing to stand up for transparency.
We often memorialize politicians who accomplish big things. We put up statues, but we often forget about politicians who sacrifice because of principles that they believe in. Michelle really took a tough stand, paid a big price for it, but she was doing the right thing. She was sticking up for Canadian taxpayers. She was sticking up for transparency. And it was great to hear from her, and really great to hear about the stand that she took.
I hope it catches on. That's it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening to the Canadian Taxpayers Podcast.
And thank you to James Wood, first of all, for blowing the whistle on that 18% tariff on medical masks and all that sort of thing. Great work on blowing up that story. Great work on editing the show for us. He takes out tons of ums and ahs for me. It's a good thing we don't pay him by the and ah, or we'd have to double his salary. And please subscribe, like, share, review our show. It really helps us get the word out to more people. And thanks again for listening.
Hi, I'm Scott Hennig, President of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. If you've got another minute, I'd like to ask you to think about the one person you know that would really enjoy listening to this podcast. Do us a favor and do them a favor and send them a quick note to let them know about it. At the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we believe there is power in numbers. That's why we've worked so hard to build an army of taxpayers who are ready to push back. And we did it because people like you shared our work with that one person that they knew would really appreciate taking part. Thanks for listening, and thanks for doing your part to make Canada a better place.